in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the translator has used the word hell on 7 different occasions in the Gospel of Matthew. So I'll look at those 7 instances and make some comments. I know that when I was growing up, these ideas were very powerful in my upbringing, and I understood the idea of heaven to be a place that I would go after I die. And I understood the idea of hell to be a place that I would go after I die if I was not a good person. And heaven would be the place that I would go if I was a good person. And so hell was a very scary place, a very scary idea for me. And it was an idea that helped, you could say, to keep me on the right road. And heaven was an idea that also helped to keep me on the right road, whatever that means, but to do good and to avoid doing evil. But these ideas were reasons that I should be a good person and reasons that I should not be a bad person. So they were very influential. I know that these ideas are still extremely powerful in the lives of people, from very, very young children all the way to old age. And I want to speak with you about how I understand these ideas in light of the primary texts in which they are found. I have been teaching at university for some 26 years. And I'll try to involve as little extraneous material as possible, but there will be sometimes I will need to refer to things that may be not directly related. And maybe I will start by looking at the worst of these 2 ideas, the idea of hell. And as I mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the most comprehensive gospel, the fullest gospel, the most involved gospel of the 4 gospels in the New Testament. So this is why I want to stay here, at least in this video. So the first reference to hell in the Gospel of Matthew comes in chapter 5, verse 22. And I actually made reference to this verse and the following verses in my prior video on my interpretation on the Sermon of the Mount. And I'll return to that idea for a moment now. So I'm just going to turn to chapter 5, verse number 20. Well, actually, let's start at 21, chapter 5, verse 21. So this is what the Gospel of Matthew says. You have heard that it was said, this is, of course, Jesus speaking to his disciples. I mentioned in my video on my interpretation on Jesus's Sermon on the Mount that Jesus was speaking to the crowds, but I realized after I made that video that he's actually speaking to his disciples here while the crowds are still there. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. I mentioned in my prior video on Jesus's Sermon on the Mount that it's a remarkable passage, because here Jesus is instructing a person to forego offering gifts to God at the altar. I guess this would be animal sacrifices, which was a very common thing in the ancient world. Definitely very common in the non-biblical world. I'm not exactly sure how common it was for the Jewish people, the Israelites. But Jesus is indicating that a human relationship is the priority, not offering sacrifices to God. And it's stunning, because if you look at the pagan world, the gods always had priority. The human being never had priority. And the human being lived in fear, and the human being always sought to please the gods who ruled over them, or else they would suffer. And the level of cruelty that we find in the non-biblical texts, for example, from ancient Greece and Rome, and also the Mesopotamian world, Near Eastern world, the area east of the region of Israel, the cruelty was really unimaginable. But here it's the human being who has priority. Now, Jesus says that if you're, I'm paraphrasing here, but if your relationships are not reconciled, then you will be liable to the hell of fire. Okay, that's the first reference in the Gospel of Matthew to this idea of hell. And so we have the idea of hell as being associated with fire. The ancient Greek word, the New Testament text, the Gospels were written in Greek. The Gospels were written in Greek, Greek of the first century. The word that has been translated as hell is Gehenna. And if you are reading these verses with me, you will see your editor has likely noted that there might be a superscript letter beside the word hell. And that will correspond to a note that he probably has, which is Gehenna. Gehenna is a Greek word that derives from a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is Hinnom. Hinnom is the valley of Hinnom. And it was actually a valley, not that far from Jerusalem. And in this valley, children were sacrificed. Human beings were sacrificed to the pagan god, Molech. And I'm not sure if they were sacrificed to other pagan gods, but they were sacrificed to the pagan god. And so it was a place where there was fire and evil. In the Hebrew scriptures in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah speaks on behalf of God and says something to the effect that, I never want this. I never asked for this. Why are you doing this? Maybe actually it might be useful to briefly turn there to see what is said in Jeremiah, if I can locate it. Um, Give me one moment. Okay. So my editor here has a note referring to the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 7, verse 31, chapter 19, verses 5 to 6, and chapter 32, verse 35. So I'm just going to go to the book of Jeremiah, and you will see in chapter 7, this is what is said. Chapter 7, verse 31. So the prophet Jeremiah here is speaking on behalf of God and says at verse number 30 onwards, verse number 30, the people of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house that is called by my name, defiling it. And they go on building the high place of Topeth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. In chapter 19 of Jeremiah, we have repeated that God didn't want this. Chapter 19, verses 5 to 6. I'm going to start at verse number 4. Because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings in it to other gods, whom neither they nor their ancestors nor the kings of Judah have known, and because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent, and gone on building the high places of Baal, the pagan storm god, Babylonian storm god, to burn their children in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it enter my mind. Therefore, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when this place shall no more be called Topeth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. And I'm going to forego the last reference. So Gehenna derives from the word that refers to this valley where children were sacrificed, it turns out, not only to Molech, but to Baal and maybe other pagan gods. I'm not sure. So the association of hell with fire has to do with the fire that was obviously present during human sacrifices. Now, later, the valley was used as a place to dump human excrement and garbage. So it became a place of filth. It became a place of excrement, a place that no one would want to be. And so when Jesus says that you will be liable to the fire of hell, one of the things he is communicating, I think, is that you will be living in filth. You will be living in a way that you're worshiping false gods. And the God that you may be worshiping is money, or the God that you may be worshiping is sex, or the God that you may be worshiping is honor and power, or reputation, fame, whatever it happens to be. If you worship false gods, if you worship these idols, then you will be living in the filth and the excrement of having sacrificed, you can say, your own life to these false gods. And we know that there are many people who do that today. How much money do you need um, in the world? There are people who have billions of dollars, thousands of millions of dollars, and there's no time to actually use it unless you just waste it. But then that actually leaves you feeling more empty. Um, and they just hoard it because, hoarding is not just about possessions, it's about money as well. And while, there's so much human suffering in the world, people people prefer, to use their lives to make money for the sole reason to make more money. So money becomes an end in itself and not a means to an end. The purpose of making money becomes making money. And in some sense, the human being sacrifices his life uh, to that end. The second reference is shortly after. It's in chapter 5, verse 29. And here, it's interesting, not so easy to understand. I'm going to start at 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. And that actually relates very much to another verse in Matthew, which I will deal with together with this, and that's at chapter 18, verse 9. And in this verse, Jesus says, I'm going to actually start at verse number 8, chapter 18, verse 8. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into the hell of fire. Now, maybe this is one reason that in certain countries, when somebody commits a crime, the hand, for example, stealing, the hand is cut off. And this kind of literal reading is not literal. It's not it it's not it's not even literal. It doesn't it actually is a distortion of the literal. If you really pay attention to the letter carefully, then you will see in the scriptures that you need to interpret what is being said, as Jesus does and as the prophets do in the Hebrew scriptures. And so to read the text literally is actually not even reading it literally. It's distorting the literal by simply staying with the literal. Because if you read it literally, then you would read all of those instructions that distinguish between the letter and the spirit, between the literal and the figurative, between uh, saying and meaning. Well, first of all, the hand never causes you to sin. So when Jesus says, if the hand causes you to sin, or if the eye causes you to sin, I can't remember. If your right hand causes you to sin, if your right eye, yeah. So if the eye or the hand causes you to sin, now the eyes or the hands never cause you to sin. Sin is a category not of the body. Sin is a category of the will, the spirit, the mind, freedom, choice. We only can sin when we make the choice to do evil. There is no sin in a world where there is no knowledge of good and evil. And in the non-biblical world, in the ancient Greek world, and in the ancient Roman world, and in the world of ancient Mesopotamia, which in the second creation story is Eden, the story of Adam and Eve. I discussed that at some length in my video on the two creation accounts in Genesis chapters 1 to 3. In a world where there's no knowledge of good and evil, there is no sin. So sin is a uniquely biblical concept because the Bible, or the biblical world, is the world in which there is a knowledge of good and evil. There is the light of God, you can say. There is the presence of God. And so the hand or the eye never cause you to sin. The body never causes you to sin. So if the eye caused you to sin, then pluck it out. If the hand caused you to sin, then pluck it out. But of course, that's impossible. But clearly, the message here is that, whatever it is that causes you to sin, whatever choices you make that cause you to sin, whatever decisions you make, pluck it out and throw it away. Don't make that the ground of your decisions, whatever it happens to be. Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's covetousness. Maybe it's jealousy. Maybe it's envy, whatever. Take that and throw it away. It's better to do that than for your soul, for your spirit, for your whole body, the text says, to go into hell, to live in the filth, in the excrement, in the world where you sacrifice your life to false idols, to false gods. The next time that hell is mentioned is in chapter 10, verse 28. And here, Jesus says, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, I want to make a distinction between how the ancient Greeks understood the soul-body relation and how the body and the soul are viewed in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew in particular. I mention the Bible because Jesus had studied the Hebrew scriptures very, very carefully, and those were the only scriptures that he knew. So there was no New Testament in Jesus's time. There were the Hebrew scriptures, and he understands himself to be fulfilling those scriptures, not rejecting them. So in the ancient Greek world, I'm thinking here of Plato in particular. Plato was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of ideas and one of the two most influential thinkers in ancient Greek philosophy. He understood the soul and the body to be completely apart in nature. And the soul was that which separated from the body after death. And that's actually when the soul was free, because the body for Plato was understood as a prison. It was understood as a disease. It was understood as a poison or a contamination. Socrates' last words. Socrates was Plato's teacher. And much of Plato's works are about Socrates and Socrates's conversations, you can say, that he had with other people. And Socrates ultimately was sentenced to death and for corrupting the youth of Athens and believing in false gods. And maybe at some point I'll work through that very, very difficult text. But just before Socrates dies, he says to his friend Crito, so Socrates used to drink the poison, the hemlock, and he drinks it. And just before he breathes his last, he tells his friend Crito, "Oh, Crito, remember to pay a cock to Asclepius. Remember and do not forget." Something like that. Remember to pay a rooster to the god of healing, the god of medicine. I owe him. It's like his death is the fulfillment of a prayer, because in death, the soul is freed from the prison of the body, and there's no question that the body was an evil in Plato and elsewhere. But in the New Testament and in the scriptures generally, the body is not separate from the soul, the body is distinct from the soul. And of course, the human being is embodied. You cannot live without a heart. You cannot live without lungs. You cannot live without a pancreas, liver, kidneys that will support life. Of course, there are substitute organs that you can get in the highly advanced stage of modern medicine, but you need something to pump the blood. You need to be able to breathe and so on. The human being cannot exist apart from the body. And we know that when somebody is sick, the body, the condition of the body really, really affects the condition of the mind. How one thinks is very, very much related to how one feels in the body. So what Jesus is saying in chapter 10, verse 28 in my reading is that there are people who will harm your body, but they're not going to, they cannot, in doing that, kill the soul, the spirit, the mind, thought, reason, consciousness. And, after Jesus died, at the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, some 50 years later, there was persecution of Christians. There had been and there would be forthcoming under the reign of Nero in 64 CE and onwards, and under the reign of Domitian from 81 to 96 of the Common Era. So the Christians were persecuted. They were fed to lions. They were gored by wild beasts and so on. They were burned alive. So the writers of the gospel are putting into the mouth of Jesus these words that whatever happens to the body, don't let that affect the soul, how you think. And there are many examples that one can raise in modern life. But I'm thinking in particular about stories of people who have been wrongfully convicted and who are imprisoned. And they some of them express enormous strength just in not letting that break them, in holding on to their identity, no matter how terrible the conditions around them are in prison, because it can really destroy you if you allow it. But that if you allow it, it's dependent on the mind and how you think. Two more that I want to look at in chapter 23. Here, Jesus is excoriating the Pharisees, who are a Jewish sect and who in the Gospel of Matthew are represented as literalists in a very bad sense. They are strict adherents of the letter of the law in the Hebrew scriptures, and they consider Jesus to be blaspheming because he is not a slave to the letter of the law. From our standpoint, from their standpoint, he was, violating the letter of the law. But from my standpoint, he refused to be a slave to that, and he grasped the distinction between the letter and the spirit, and so he was focused on the meaning of what was said rather than simply following like an unthinking automaton what was said. But the Pharisees considered this to be blaspheming because he would violate the letter of the law to defend the spirit of the law. And, maybe it would be worthwhile just looking at an instance where Jesus does that. In chapter 12 of the Gospel of Matthew, for example, Jesus is on the Sabbath, which is supposed to be a day in which the Jews should not do any work. And one can understand that. I mentioned in one of my prior videos that it wasn't during my lifetime, when I was young, there was no shops open on Sundays in the malls. I don't think you were allowed to open on Sundays. I think it was against the law because, for a very simple reason, the human being is not just a slave of labor. He's not a camel. He's not a beast of burden. And so there was a law that you couldn't work on Sundays, right? It's a day to enjoy. It's a day to spend time with people that you care about. It's a day to think. It's a day to relax. Whatever. It's not a day to work. You have to take some time off. We all know that. But on the Sabbath, Jesus is actually picking grains with his disciples. And this is what is said in chapter 12, verse number 1 onwards. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Why are Jesus and his disciples picking grain? Because his disciples are hungry. And Jesus knows that while the letter of the law is to rest on the Sabbath, the reason for that law is to help human beings. And so if the human being is hungry and needs help or needs food or whatever, of course you do. You get food. And if somebody is sick, of course you help. The spirit of the law is to help human beings. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, this very same story is told, and Jesus says, "The Sabbath was made for man," or humankind. Man, humankind, was not made for the Sabbath. The law is made for man. Man is not made for the law. The reason that the law has validity is because it is good for human beings. The human being is not subordinate to the law. The validity of the law, the goodness of the law, comes in the fact that it is good, helpful for human beings. But the Pharisees accuse him of violating the law because they are literalists in the worst possible sense. At least they're represented that way in the Gospel of Matthew. We don't know historically whether the Pharisees were like this during Jesus's time. Scholars believe that they might have been like this during the writer's time, because the writer was some 50 years or so after Jesus died. And the writer simply put that tension into the stories that he tells, or that there were more than one writer, then the writers tell. So Jesus says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And he quotes the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea, chapter 6, verse 6. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Hosea there was speaking on behalf of God, as the Hebrew prophets do. God said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire human compassion, not ritual, mechanistic sacrifices for a God that is somehow apart from how human beings relate to each other. So that's one instance where Jesus comes into conflict with the Pharisees. But getting back to the idea of hell in chapter 23, the reason that I made that reference is because here, once again, you have Jesus and the Pharisees in extreme tension at this point. And maybe what I'll do is I'll start reading, from about maybe verse number 13, chapter 23 of the Gospel of Matthew. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, scribes or experts in the law, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven, for you do not go in yourselves, and when others go in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land. Oh, that's the phone. Let me turn. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides. I'm going to jump here to verse number 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, while on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. It's such a rich diatribe against the hypocrites. Now, let me just mention a couple of things. So within those verses that I read, Jesus mentions that they are focused on following the minutest letter of the law, like tithing mint, dill, and cumin. There must be references in the Hebrew scriptures. I think that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. But while they're, following these minutest things, they're neglecting the weightier matters of the law, the spirit of the law, justice and mercy and faith. They are blind, Jesus says. Straining out a gnat, but swallowing a camel. It reminds me of these verses in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Matthew, which I have discussed in my video on the Sermon on the Mount. Why do you judge? Why do you try to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own eye? First, take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So the Pharisees are judging, but their judgment are only applied outwards. They are only blaming people who, in appearance, are not following the law. But the Pharisees are represented here as not looking at anything but appearances. That's why they are like whitewashed tombs on the outside. The cup is all clean on the outside, but inside it's dirty, it's filthy. The tomb is white on the outside, but inside it's full of bones of the dead. Now, in chapter 15, Jesus is also very, very principled in his attack on the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are accusing him or his disciples or both of eating with unwashed hands. And he says to them that it's not the things that go into the mouth that defile a person. It's the things that come out of the mouth that defile a person. What comes out of the mouth is your words, your intentions, your thoughts. What goes into the mouth goes into the sewer. So Jesus is very, very critical about this way of thinking where evil is somehow found in the external, food in this particular case, and not, or the unwashed hands, and not in one's heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, at this point, maybe I should make a correction. I made a mistake in my video on the Sermon on the Mount in looking at the Beatitudes. I mentioned that the Beatitudes, beatitude comes from the Latin word beatus, which means blessing, but it actually means blessed. So the Beatitudes are declarations of blessedness. A small issue, but I do want to hold myself accountable for that. So the Pharisees, yes, they stop people from entering the kingdom of heaven. At verse number 14, but they make the convert twice as much a child of hell as themselves in verse number 15, right? Hell, again, it refers to a filthy condition. And it's filthy. To be a hypocrite is filthy because you are not critical of your own judgments. In the Pharisees' case, your judgments are only turned outwards. Hypocritical means below the critical threshold, or not uncritical. They